Cromwell. I'm the chair of the Dorothy Day Lecture Committee, and I want to welcome you all here today, say thank you for coming, and it is great to see so many people here. Thank you. Our topic today, artificial intelligence. It is, to say the least, being hotly debated throughout the world at the present time. And while AI can be an invaluable tool, it has its downsides. It could also be a threat to a fair and just society and to our individual freedoms. Today's speaker, Kade Crockford, thank you, Director of the Technology for Liberty program at the Massachusetts American Civil Liberties Union, will walk us through the facts and fiction of artificial intelligence. Emmanuel College has a new president. Amazing. Dr. Beth Ross. Following a tenure as acting president, the Board of Trustees unanimously elevated Dr. Ross to the presidency in January. Her leadership qualities and demonstrated commitment to mission make her an apt successor to Sister Janet Eisner and other sisters of the Notre Dame de Namur who have led Emmanuel since 1919. Dr. Ross has been at Emmanuel for over 23 years, assuming progressive levels of responsibility over the years, including critical roles in strategic planning and as Dean of Institutional Effectiveness and Chief Data Officer. Please join me in welcoming our 14th president, Dr. Beth Ross.
Thank you, Marie. And good afternoon. What a privilege it is to gather here today with the Emmanuel community, our faculty, our staff, our friends, but most particularly our alumni for this 2024 Dorothy Day Lecture. Incisive intellectual discourse, the will to act as catalysts for positive change, a commitment to the liberal arts as a foundation for informed and wise analysis of the most pressing and complex issues facing our society. These are just a few of the hallmarks of the Emmanuel experience that this lecture series has come to embody since its inception in 2013. These gatherings also serve as a joyful celebration of the bonds that continue to unite our graduates across the decades and of the vital role they continue to play in the life of the college. I want to pay tribute in a special way to the members, or as they may say, the Emmas of the class of 1971. Who envisioned this lecture series over a decade ago and led the way in making it a reality. 71 grads, you, along with others of your era, attended Emmanuel at a time of dramatic change in the realms of politics, culture, the arts, and religion, and not just observers, but often as active participants. The creativity of the time and the power of your own lived experiences is infused into the topics you have chosen for this series and is reflected in the leading lights you have selected as speakers over the years, very much including the esteemed guests we will introduce in just a moment. As some of you may know, the person for whom this lecture series is named, Dorothy Day, visited Emmanuel on 2 occasions, in the 1930s and in the 1960s. During these visits, she inspired many with her reflections on the Catholic worker movement, which she co-founded, as well as her commentary on the fault lines underlining our contemporary society, from nuclear arms to the ever-growing divide between the global haves and have-nots. The author Robert Coles, who once worked in one of Dorothy Day's houses of hospitality, recalled that she laughed at the notion of becoming a saint. Still, I think that in many ways she is a saint for our times, as we work to heal the widening divisions in the body politic, honor the dignity of the most vulnerable among us, and strive to advance a civilization predicated on love of neighbor. As she herself once wrote, the final word is love. I'm deeply grateful to all of you for coming today. Particular thanks goes to the members of the Dorothy Day Lecture Series Steering Committee and the Speaker Selection Committee for this great care that you take in making this such a superb lecture event every year. I now invite to the podium Maureen Rogers of the class of 1971, who will introduce our 2024 Dorothy Day Lecture Series.
Maureen Rogers, Emma here. In these are perilous times, we face a litany of worries. We worry about social justice. We worry about changing climate. We worry about gun violence. We worry about our divisive politics. We worry about the seemingly intractable situation in Gaza, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Ukraine. And now, looking in the recesses of our already worrying minds, there's AI. Artificial intelligence. What exactly is it? What's it going to do for us? What's it going to do with us? What's it going to do to us? Seldom has an emerging technology simultaneously held such great promise while presenting such a grave threat. We of course welcome the promise, but fear that the threats to our livelihood, our privacy, and our freedoms. Threats, think of widespread surveillance, often couched in terms assuring us that it's a small price to pay for what we get in return. Threats, think of widespread surveillance, that are most likely to be targeted and impact already marginalized communities, people of color, Muslims, immigrants, dissidents. The good news is that there are those among us who don't accept that AI will inevitably take control. Guardians who are fighting to ensure that we don't let the potentially harmful AI aspects just happen. We're fortunate today to have with us one such guardian, Kade Crockford. Kade is director, as Marie told us, of the Technology for Liberty program at the ACLU of Massachusetts, where they focus their prodigious passion, intelligence, and expertise on the intersection of technology and civil liberties. At Mass ACLU, Kade led the organization's Press Pause on Face Surveillance initiative, which resulted in the passage of a Massachusetts state law that regulates police use of facial recognition. The Commonwealth is one of the few states to have adopted such a reform. Kade has written for a range of publications, including Nature, The Nation, and The Guardian. As an authority on matters relating to technology, policing, and surveillance, they make regular appearances in the media and at conferences. Kade's TEDx talk has gotten well over 2 million views on the TED site, and they have spoken at South by Southwest, the annual Austin-based conference where technology, film, music, education, and culture converge. In a recent National Geographic article, Kade had this to say: "This is about essentially basic protections to ensure that technology advances human creativity, productivity, exploration, connection, communication, and does so without imperiling our privacy, our bodily autonomy, our ability, frankly, to control our own lives." Kade was speaking about the use and abuse of location data, but it could just as easily have been about AI and the future of freedom, the topic of today's lecture. And with that, I am honored to give the podium over to Kade Crockford.
I don't even know if I have anything left to say. That was great, thank you. It's so wonderful to be here, so thank you so much to the college and to the committee for the invitation, and thank you to you all. Today's a really beautiful day, so I appreciate that you came here to spend it listening to me talk for an hour about really depressing stuff like surveillance, dystopia, authoritarianism. I just want to say right off the bat that I'm speaking today on behalf of myself and not the ACLU of Massachusetts, which may or may not agree with some of the things that I'm about to say. Over the next hour, I'm going to argue that the message Silicon Valley is sending us about the inevitability of AI is self-interested and incorrect. That the people who are driving the AI hype train are largely out of touch with reality, that AI is causing tremendous harm today, that this harm can and must be resisted, and that the problem of AI and big tech more broadly is inseparable from the dominant political problems that we face today, namely wealth disparities and authoritarianism. Finally, I'm going to ask you to examine your own power in relation to technology that very wealthy people are trying to shove down our throats. Contrary to the message that big tech sends, we actually do have the power to resist their vision of the future and insist on our own. But like our power in a democracy, our power to do so is only meaningful if we're informed and we know how to flex it, and we do. So just by way of framing, I'll
confess at the outset that I share Antonio Gramsci's view that while my mind tells me things are hopelessly bad and unlikely to improve, my heart and soul truly remain optimistic. I also appreciate Miriam Kava, the abolitionist's insistence that hope is a discipline. It's something that we create through action. So while this will be a sobering lecture, it's my plan that you leave here not depressed but inspired, because we are, after all, each of us alive right now on this earth. And as long as that remains the case, we owe it to ourselves and to future generations to try to do our best to repair the world. Doing so is a fitting tribute to the namesake of this lecture, Dorothy Day. Day was, as you know, a radical Catholic. She was a journalist, an anarchist, an activist. She believed fiercely in the inherent dignity of every living person. She was particularly concerned about the poor, those who got the short end of the stick during the Industrial Revolution that shortly preceded her birth and defined the political, economic, and social conditions of the world that she inherited in the early 20th century. The robber barons of the late 19th and early 20th centuries fought for a society and an economy that prized efficiency and ruthlessness and maximum private profit over the common good. Does that sound familiar? They're not so different in that way from the robber barons of Silicon Valley. They defrauded investors. They destroyed the environment and pillaged the earth without concern for the future. They lobbied the highest levels of government to protect their rackets. They oppressed workers by turning them into cogs and paying them a tiny fraction of the wealth they generated. They bought up competitors and created monopolies. And to bend history and opinion in their favor, they created endowments, universities, and charitable trusts, many of which still exist today. Among the cheerleaders for the Industrial Revolution and the transfer of wealth from the masses to a handful of elites that it facilitated was this man, Charles Babbage, considered the grandfather of modern computing. I'm going to take this off, I'm sorry, I'm getting really hot. A key element necessary to the Industrial Revolution and the success of the robber barons was the disciplining of labor through a regime that has come to be known as Taylorism. As critical tech thinker Meredith Whittaker has observed, Charles Babbage, this man, was a Taylorist before a tailor. As early as the 1830s, Babbage's key insight was that each piece of a worker's job could be broken down into segments, that each of these segments could be measured through the collection of data, and that an analysis of those data could be used to extract maximum efficiency from each cog in the machine, that is, each human worker. In this way, Charles Babbage was one of the first thinkers to advance a coherent theory of workplace surveillance and control, also known in management speak as optimization. If industrialists knew exactly how long it should take for an efficient worker to perform each step of his or her work, they could exert pressure on the workforce to conform to a standardized production output. We can see the echoes of Babbage's theories in Amazon's sprawling delivery operation today, as each worker's every movement is surveilled, cataloged, analyzed, and used against them, leading to extremely alarming headlines about workers being forced to pee in bottles for fear of missing their production numbers. Efficiency is not necessarily a bad thing, of course, but when we're evaluating the merits of any system, we must ask two critical questions: who benefits and who decides? And this is exactly how we must approach thinking through the revolution in computing that we're currently living through, known as the age of artificial intelligence, the ultimate optimization machine, or so its boosters would have us believe. Who benefits and who decides? Sorry, it's him. Today, in the absence of sufficient regulatory and legal action from states and the federal government, the people benefiting and the people deciding belong to a very elite group, the super wealthy venture capitalists and big shots of big tech. Silicon Valley billionaires insist that tools like ChatGPT will fundamentally remake our world, they say, for the better. They demand that rules be discarded in their favor because they are visionaries who must move fast and break things. Anyone who gets in their way, according to them, is a Luddite, hopelessly out of touch with the demands of the 21st century. Theirs is an ideology of technological determinism on steroids. Because something is technically possible, it is inevitable and even beneficent. They believe technology is a way around and above the messy realities of democracy, ecology, and mortality. They insist AI will be deployed in every conceivable area by every conceivable actor, that it will disrupt every occupation, discipline, and area of public and private life. We are to take this medicine and to thank them for it, indeed to herald them as modern Galileos delivering us from darkness. Theirs is a quasi-religious belief in technological manifest destiny. They believe human beings will develop technology that will eradicate all social problems, allow humans to meld with machines, end mortality, and colonize the stars. Many of them believe in the accumulation of obscene private wealth because they think they know best how to spend money to advance what they call long-term human well-being. They call this ideology effective altruism. Its adherents believe the most pressing threat to humanity stems not from climate change or authoritarianism, which clearly are the most pressing threats facing humanity, but rather a sci-fi hypothesis that so-called sentient AI will take over the world and kill all humans. So historically, when people have spoken like this in public, they've been viewed as mentally unstable and in need of psychiatric care. But if you have enough money and clout in the valley, you can talk this way and people will not only take you seriously, they will print your rantings and ravings in the pages of prestigious newspapers and call you a visionary. You may have heard of effective altruism because one of the most disgraced financial criminals of the past 100 years, Sam Bankman-Fried, this guy, someone who defrauded crypto investors of $10 billion, spent the years prior to his arrest promoting it. While obsessing over the singularity, the moment when humans supposedly will lose control of technology might be a fringe occupation, the people preoccupied by it are not fringe actors. These views are held by some of the most powerful people in charge of developing and unleashing technology into our world. Besides notorious crypto scammer Sam Bankman-Fried, other notable effective altruists in tech include Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, the right-wing billionaire and Silicon Valley power broker who has said he believes freedom and democracy are incompatible, and once wrote that women's enfranchisement was bad for democracy. Elon Musk and even Peter Thiel's extreme views and support for authoritarian political actors are relatively well known, but the rot runs much deeper. As just one example, let's turn to the words of one of the most powerful venture capitalists in the country, Mark Andreessen, who last year published a disturbing 5,000-word rant entitled The Techno-Optimist Manifesto. Here are some direct quotes from that document. Quote, "We believe artificial intelligence is our alchemy, our philosopher's stone. We are literally making sand think." Quote, "We believe any deceleration of AI will cost lives. Deaths that were preventable by the AI that was prevented from existing is a form of murder." Quote, "We believe in nature. We also believe in overcoming nature. We are not primitives cowering in fear of the lightning bolt. We are the apex predator. The lightning works for us." He also described what he called the enemy. Quote, "Our present society has been subjected to a mass demoralization campaign for 6 decades against technology and against life, under varying names like, get ready for this, existential risk, sustainability, ESG, sustainable development goals, social responsibility, stakeholder capitalism, precautionary principle, trust and safety, tech ethics, risk management, degrowth, and the limits of growth." That's the enemy for Andreessen. Today, Andreessen and men like him are funding and unleashing technology on the world without waiting for regulation, democratic engagement, or legal guardrails to protect the most vulnerable. There are also, many of them, profoundly unlikable and even alien to people who care about things like art, the humanities, and literature, which I assume is everyone in this room. Less than 2 weeks ago, Andreessen's company announced it had raised over $7 billion to invest in AI startups. On the firm's website, you can find a talk where one of his AI boosters, Martin Casado, claims technologies like ChatGPT are, quote, "far better than humans at communication and social interaction and creativity." with due respect to Mr. Casado, he shouldn't generalize about his own experience and assume it applies to everyone. Some of us, in fact, know very interesting and remarkable people. Andreessen's manifesto, in which, again, he says slowing AI down is akin to murder, and calls tech ethics and sustainability enemies of progress, is remarkable for its frankness. But while CEOs of mainstream companies like Meta and Google won't come out and say such anti-democratic things publicly, their companies are part of industry associations that work day and night behind the scenes in state capitals and in Washington to ensure that any regulation of the technology industry, including privacy legislation, which is a first-order requirement of any functioning society's response to the big tech surveillance economy, does not either dies rather or emerges in such a blanched and feeble form that it doesn't impact the core of their business, which is surveillance. Their army of lobbyists, this is the tech industry, is working hard to make sure the law does not stand between them and maximum profit. Unlike Andreessen, the leaders of these companies are required to care about public opinion, and so they're more likely to listen to their marketing and communications departments, and they're therefore more strategic about managing their public perception and the perception of their companies. But in the most important sense, when it comes to what these companies do, rather than what they say, they are aligned with the fundamentally libertarian view Andreessen espouses in his mask-off manifesto. The market is always right, innovation is always good, and the government and civil society should stay out of the way. But the men, and yes, it seems to be mostly men, most of whom are either white or South Asian, overseeing the AI hype revolution are not merely using lobbyists to fight efforts to bring their technology under democratic control. Many of them, and this is not a coincidence, are also virulently anti-labor. Musk's Tesla and Bezos's Amazon, for example, have put tremendous effort toward ensuring the increasingly militant and revitalized labor movement, which is one of the true bright spots in today's dim political landscape, does not bring workplace democracy to their organizations. Indeed, they are waging a legal war on the rights of workers to unionize more broadly. These billionaires see allies in executives who wish to replace their workers with technology, and they understand that organized labor is probably the most important threat to their vision of the world. If you listen to any startup or CEO or venture capitalist today talk about everything AI will deliver for you, for your business, for capitalism, the message is very consistent. The view from the valley is clear. Their vision of the future is the only one that matters, and mere mortals cannot stand in the way of the inevitable march of progress, defined by them, of course. If you listen carefully, you'll notice that they don't even try to sell us on their products anymore. Instead, they simply say, in the future, you will. As if they're giving us orders, instead of making a case for why we should use their products. It's actually a neat communications trick to make it seem like ordinary people have no agency, that no matter what we do, we will be steamrolled by their technology. It's their world, and we are just data points primed for monetization. Yet, of course, when pressed, some of them may concede that generative AI unleashed on the public will result in an explosion of scams, disinformation, cyber attacks. Yes, they admit there's no way to train their data-hungry generative AI algorithms except by acting as if journalists, academics, poets, novelists, filmmakers, photographers, musicians, visual artists, and other creative workers do not have meaningful intellectual property rights. And sure, powering the data centers and computers that make up the physical backbones of generative AI systems consumes enormous quantities of finite natural resources like water and fossil fuels, exacerbating environmental collapse. But we are told, again, these are externalities we have to accept because their vision of the future is fate. Like these claims, like all technology, AI is inherently political. And despite what AI hype boosters desperately want us to believe, their vision of the future is not predetermined. In fact, it's based on highly questionable relationship to the truth about existing and near future technological capabilities. And this is not new. Interestingly, exaggerated claims about AI's brilliance have been with us for a very long time. In fact, back in 1965, Nobel Prize winner Herb Simon, who was a leading AI researcher at the time, said, quote, this is 1965, "Machines will be capable within 20 years, he said, of doing any work a man can do." Obviously, that didn't pan out. More recently, Elon Musk has promised fully autonomous Teslas every year since 2014. So I would like to discuss AI as it is. And to do so, I think it would be helpful to be on the same page about some basic concepts. So this part's going to be boring. You can take a nap. What is artificial intelligence? It's not a scientific term. It's instead actually a marketing term. And it's a pretty clever one at that. In part because it obscures the central role human beings play at every stage of AI development. It also implies incorrectly that machines can possess something akin to human intelligence. I want to be clear, they cannot. Machines cannot think and they cannot feel. AI usually refers to a type of computer science known as machine learning, of which there are multiple different varieties. People generally categorize them into 3 buckets. Here's a very complicated slide. If you're interested in looking at it, please do. There's supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement learning. With supervised learning, human beings create data sets made up of labeled information. They use those labeled data sets to train algorithms, and along the way, they provide feedback to improve the algorithm's performance. So there are 2 types of supervised learning algorithms. There's classification and regression. With classification systems, the algorithm spits out a prediction about how a piece of data ought to be classified. So for example, is this image a picture of President Obama, yes or no? Is this email spam or not spam? Regression systems make a prediction using a numerical output, expressed oftentimes through a percentage. So for example, what's the chance that the Boston Celtics are going to win the NBA Finals? 100. In supervised learning systems, algorithms learn patterns from unlabeled data sets through methods including clustering and anomaly detection. So in other words, in these systems, the technology is looking for patterns in unlabeled data. And then in the third kind, in reinforcement learning, algorithms are trained through a punishment and reward system with the goal of teaching an algorithm how to perform a series of actions, including in response to external stimuli. So in short, supervised learning makes predictions, unsupervised learning looks for patterns in data, and reinforcement learning learns a series of actions. Supervised learning makes up the bulk of commercially viable AI technology that's impacting us today, including things like facial recognition and market forecasting. And the most important exception, which we're going to talk a lot about, is generative AI, which is developed using a combination of unsupervised and supervised techniques. So with large language models like ChatGPT, the model is trained on huge quantities of unlabeled data, that's everyone's copyright protected information, using an unsupervised process. That is, the model is trained to look for patterns between words. So effectively what ChatGPT is doing is guessing what word ought to come after another by very closely studying patterns between words. It does not understand anything. After that process, the unrefined algorithm is trained by using, subjected to intensive human scrutiny by human beings who use a smaller labeled data set. So that's the supervised part. And this latter process is essential to ensure that tools like chatbots don't spew hate speech and disinformation, but obviously it doesn't really work. This was immediately evident when Microsoft released its first public chatbot on Twitter in 2016. Tay, as she was known, started saying some pretty wild and offensive stuff right from the jump, and Microsoft quickly pulled it offline. As you may have seen from recent reporting about the latest chatbots and generative AI systems, this problem has not gone away in the intervening 8 years. In February of 2024, just last couple months ago, Google's Gemini tool produced an image of a black Nazi in response to a prompt asking for illustrations of German soldiers from 1943. There's also an Asian woman Nazi. A critical point about the development and operation of AI systems is that they rely on human intervention and are shaped by human biases at every level of their development. from the decisions about the areas in which to deploy AI, which is extremely important, to the problems that they're trying to solve, to the choices of which data to use, to the labeling of that data, to the adjustments, to the parameters in the algorithm, to deciding when the algorithm is good enough to unleash on the public. Importantly, these decisions are never made by the people most impacted by the technology in the wild. And in most cases, those people also have no say in determining whether the AI will be used in any given context for any given purpose. So for example, the decision to use an AI in a healthcare setting is not made by patients. It is likely not even made by doctors. It is made by hospital executives who in our for-profit healthcare system have pretty vastly different priorities than patients and doctors. So let's take the development and use of the ImageNet database. ImageNet is a database that was created by Princeton AI researchers in 2006. Today the database contains more than 14 million images. The goal of the project was to create a database large enough to train computer vision algorithms, which is a form of supervised machine learning that uses the classification method. This database contains over 20,000 20,000 categories of different images, 14 million images, with hundreds or thousands in each category. So for example, hundreds of pictures of apples, thousands of pictures of dinosaurs, etc. Each of these images is labeled by a human being, paid a very low wage through Amazon's Mechanical Turk program. According to the New York Times, these workers label up to 50 images per minute. As you might imagine, labeling something like a red apple is relatively benign, straightforward, but as artist Trevor Paglen found when he hired a programmer to train a computer vision algorithm on ImageNet's database, other types of data labeling are not so benign, namely those that involve us, human beings. So Paglen used ImageNet's labeled images of human faces to create an algorithm and make a project he called ImageNet Roulette. Did anybody see this when it was online? It's very cool. While the project was online, anyone could upload an image of a person to see how the algorithm trained on ImageNet's data would classify that face. The results were at turns horrifying, shocking, amusing, offensive. That's because the low-paid Mechanical Turk workers who labeled the images of human beings that fed into this algorithm were free to do so really however they saw fit. There's no supervision of that work. Labels included race, gender, occupation, and even totally subjective and seemingly random categories like slut, pipe smoker, microeconomist, and terrorist. So while a person might look at an image of Barack Obama, one of the labelers, and label it politician, another might label it traitor. As soon as ImageNet Roulette launched online, Twitter lit up with all of these examples of people testing the system. So here you can see on the far right, a black man who's posting that he doesn't find it particularly funny that this system labeled him a wrongdoer, offender, or his brown friend a spree killer. People also tested the system using images of famous people. So my favorite is that Hillary Clinton's neck is a skier. It's pretty good. In response to this project, the creators of the ImageNet database took down the images of human faces out of their data set. ImageNet Roulette helped a pretty broad audience better understand how human bias infects artificial intelligence systems from root to branch. It helps us see how AI is not distinct from human intelligence, but rather, as Joey Ito, the former head of the MIT Media Lab, has written, an extension of our intelligence, or our stupidity. Similar problems exist with unsupervised machine learning systems, those that don't use labeled training data, but rather look for patterns in data. So how could human bias creep into those systems? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Every data set fed into an unsupervised machine learning system is produced by human beings about human beings. So the data sets are therefore reflective of all of our systemic problems like racism, wealth inequality, gender inequity, and the like, as well as simple human error, which is something that happens a lot. This dynamic has led some people to joke that AI is humans, like Soylent Green. And that's actually often true in more than just a metaphorical sense. It's sometimes true literally. So it turns out companies have been marketing supposedly AI-driven software and products that are either backstopped or wholly run by human workers doing hidden real-time labor masquerading as advanced technology. This was the case with delivery robots we saw popping up during COVID on college campuses, which were not piloted by AI, but rather by workers in remote foreign countries using joysticks. It was also the case with Amazon's Just Walk Out stores. Did you remember reading about that? These stores that Amazon opened where you didn't have to go to a register, you could just pick something up off the shelf and walk out of the store because this magical AI was gonna use facial recognition to determine who you were and track all your purchases and then just send you a bill in the mail. Well, apparently that was not actually what happened. We learned recently that a slew, about 1,000 workers off-site in India, unseen, were watching surveillance video and carefully tallying people's purchases to check against this AI system. Another example is a company called Presto Automations that provides so-called AI services for fast food restaurants. It's basically a chatbot. They publicly claimed that 95% of orders taken by their chatbots did not require any human worker oversight or intervention. Turns out marketing is a little different from what they told the SEC in official filings, where they acknowledged that 70% of those orders actually did require human intervention. So, you know, the delivery robots, the Just Walk Out stores, the phenomenon, it's called vaporware. Bill Gates famously employed the vaporware tactic in his first major deal. He called the founder of instrumentation telemetry systems and offered to make software for that company's Altair for it, but he was confident that his team would figure it out, and to their credit, they did. Gates' fake it till you make it gambit actually worked, but others have failed spectacularly. Theranos, the blood testing startup founded by Elizabeth Holmes, comes to mind. Theranos promised technology it had not built to Walgreens. It failed to deliver on claims that seemed too good to be true because they were indeed too good to be true. And Elizabeth Holmes went to federal prison. There's a name, as I said, for this. It's vaporware. The current AI hype train rests almost exclusively on these fake it till you make it claims. And these are vitally important for the investors in major corporations who have poured hundreds of billions of dollars into the technology. If people do not believe that AI can perform magic, they might not adopt the technology. And if they don't adopt the technology, the companies that have staked their reputations and stock values on explosive AI growth are really going to suffer. This is why AI hype hucksters have poured so much energy into elevating the technology to absurd heights via media tours and wild, easily debunked claims about the technology's current capabilities. But you know, it's always just around the corner, right? Full self-driving next year, right, Elon? The point is to inflate the value of the technology in the public's mind, because without headlinings proclaiming the end of work, the rise of smart machines, and the transformation of every sector of our economy, would the technology actually hold any real monetary value? I'm arguing the answer is no, obviously, or at least that the real monetary value of AI does not come close to matching what the hype pushers like this guy would have us believe. I know that this argument runs contrary to pretty much everything you've heard and read in the media over the past year and a half since ChatGPT was launched, so allow me to demonstrate. Let's turn to some of the ways that AI is currently being deployed, or to better understand what's real and what's not. And as important, the tasks AI is actually well suited to and those it is not. Because while a lot of AI, namely generative AI, is massively overhyped, some AI is extremely powerful and doing great damage. So for now, let's continue with the elephant in the room, the most overhyped of them all, generative AI. It's been a year and a half since ChatGPT was publicly launched. Tech executives and a compliant media have pushed the narrative that Gen AI will change everything, like this guy. So has it? In a word, no. Let's review some examples of how we've seen large language models actually being used in the wild. So the first, this is my favorite. The mayor of New York City, who's something of a buffoon, in my opinion, Eric Adams, did something really buffoonish, which is launched this chatbot on the New York City's public website, for small businesses, where they could get answers to basic questions about, how to run a small business and what's legal in New York. A tech outlet, critical tech outlet called The Markup, decided to actually play around with this tool and found that it was spitting not just disinformation, but giving people advice to break the law in New York City. So, a couple of examples here. They asked the thing, are buildings required to accept Section 8 vouchers? An important question for landlords. NYC chatbot says, no, buildings are not required to accept Section 8 vouchers. Well, of course that's false. They are. There are a litany of other examples. So after this went public, the internet took to playing with this tool. The memes were incredible. The value to business in New York, marginal at best, downright dangerous at worst. This was one of my favorite examples. I saw this on a blog recently. Shortly after the derailment of the train in East Palestine, Ohio, a blogger who knows about these kinds of things decided to test ChatGPT with a related query. So he wrote how to respond to a vinyl chloride fire, and ChatGPT said basically to put water on it, which would have turned the situation into something much worse. Another example, this is something that I know a lot about, Massachusetts wiretap law. Exciting, right? So I asked the technology, it is illegal to secretly record someone in Massachusetts. It is. Here's what the system told me. This is almost top to bottom misinformation. Massachusetts wiretap law is not going to kill you if you violate it, but there are some pretty hefty penalties attached, so you could get sued. Google, not to be outdone by Microsoft's partnership with OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT, has launched its own tool called Gemini. Among other features, Gemini allows users to upload pictures of things to learn more about them. One user uploaded a picture of this nice mushroom, and the AI confidently told the user the mushroom was, yes, of course, edible, delicious, yummy. But according to mushroom experts, this is actually a highly toxic specimen that essentially liquefies the human liver and causes painful death within about 24 hours. So this is frightening, but there's an attendant problem, which is that if you look on Amazon right now, you will find huge quantities of so-called books written by generative AI, some of which are mushroom identification books. This is going to get someone killed. Examples of generative AI providing people with total bullshit information, but I think my favorite example is this one. They've invented a computer that can't do math. Genuinely impressive. Then there's internet search. So have you noticed that when you try to go on Google or whatever to find information that you just can't, that Google has completely fallen apart? Author and tech thinker Cory Doctorow has coined the phrase "enshittification" to describe the decreasing quality of basic internet services we've all come to rely upon. Generative AI makes it easier than ever for spammers to produce huge quantities of garbage content, much of it never reviewed by a human being, let alone edited. Search engine optimization experts craft this content with one goal in mind: to get their links to the top of Google and other search engine results. Making matters worse, search leaders like Google and Microsoft Bing have launched generative AI search tools. That was what Gemini was trying to do. But the information they return is often unreliable and sometimes entirely made up. Obviously, this problem is going to get rapidly worse if AI-generated content is fed into AI systems as training data, which is likely to happen as the sheer volume of it swells online, and then we'll have generative AI systems trained on made-up bullshit, made up by generative AI, served up to us on a silver platter by generative AI. So yeah, enshittification, that sounds right. Then there's misinformation and disinformation. This is one of the best use cases for generative AI because it doesn't matter if what it says is true, right? As any user of these systems knows, like if you've ever used ChatGPT or whatever, you know that they're not actually very good at producing reliable quality information, but they are excellent at sounding extremely confident. They're like, 16-year-old boys. No offense to those who are 16-year-old boys. So, here's some examples of very disturbing political misinformation. These are fake images that somebody used one of these, Stability AI or Midjourney to create. So we see, a photo of Trump supporters in red holding guns marching towards the United States Capitol. We see on the bottom right a photo of an election worker damaging the machinery of voting machines. We see Joe Biden with his body double. Hey, Joe. Okay, so this is a real problem. In Europe, a pro-democracy civil society organization based in Berlin asked Google's Gemini, OpenAI's ChatGPT 3.5 and 4, and Microsoft's Copilot very basic questions about the European elections. None of them consistently provided accurate answers. As one of the study authors said, when you ask AI chatbots something for which they don't have a lot of material, they just invent something. They don't say, I don't know. They just make something up. Another example, Trump supporters have been sharing AI-generated images of black people hanging out with Donald Trump, my man DT, as part of an effort to convince black people there is significant support within the community for the former president. According to Freedom House's new Freedom on the Net report, researchers documented actors in 16 countries using AI to, quote, sow doubt, smear opponents, or influence public debate. Crucially, AI doesn't just result in a glut of bullshit on the internet, it also undermines trust. Trust in media, trust in one another, and it allows bad actors to further erode the sense that we all share a political and social reality, which we already know is a pretty big problem without AI. It's very troubling, for example, to imagine someone like Donald Trump using deepfakes to smear political opponents. It's equally troubling to imagine Donald Trump saying, that grab him by the pussy video, that wasn't me, that's a deepfake. That didn't happen. So these are all scary examples of ways generative AI can be used to harm people, which are equally concerning. Deepfake pornography, cyber attacks, fraud is one of the best use cases for generative AI. I just want to be clear, I don't think that there's no valuable use for this technology, that there's no productive, non-harmful use for generative AI. I'm pretty close, but not quite. After testing these tools myself, though, and talking to a lot of people who have experimented with them, it seems to me that the best that they can really do is provide the level of expert help that a high school intern might. And I'm not exaggerating, that's really what I think. They can be helpful in some clerical tasks, but their work cannot be relied upon for anything important, ever. They are, as scholar Emily Bender, who's a linguist, has written, stochastic parrots. They don't know answers to questions, and they can't be relied upon to provide accurate information because they don't know or understand language. They are merely good at pretending that they do, which I think is really dangerous. So I'm not alone in thinking that this hype bubble is maybe going to burst. People are starting to take note that there's a huge gap between the hype and the reality around generative AI. In fact, the industry is now tamping down expectations that it will be able to demonstrate meaningful profit from systems that require huge quantities of money, finite resources, and human workers to function, but are clearly in search of use cases that can help them turn a profit. And then there's this sword of Damocles hanging over the head of every company executive currently betting the farm on generative AI, copyright law. The New York Times is suing OpenAI, alleging that the company stole copyrighted content and used it to train algorithms without the paper's consent. Getty has filed a similar lawsuit against Stability AI, the maker of image generator Stable Diffusion, arguing that the company stole 12 million of Getty's copyright-protected images. I'll just say, one time Getty came after me for using one of their pictures on my blog, and it was kind of scary. Like, they're really serious. If I did that 12 million times, I'd be in prison. They would have taken my house, like, for real. Many other similar lawsuits have been filed by artists and other creative workers. OpenAI, for its part, this is the general argument that the industry makes, they've publicly admitted that they would not be able to have generative AI systems if they didn't use people's copyrighted information. But they say that the algorithms are merely learning from copyrighted content, and that the content they generate is informed by but meaningfully distinct from intellectual property that they've trained on. So what they say basically is that, yeah, it's just like you. You know, you read the paper, you get some ideas, then you talk to your friends. Like, okay, bro. The New York Times and others, though, point to the fact that it is pretty easy to get ChatGPT to spit out huge chunks of verbatim copyright material, a problem that has led reporters to call large language models like ChatGPT, quote, giant plagiarism machines. It remains to be seen whether courts okay what writers and artists are calling the biggest intellectual property heist of all time. And there's a real likelihood that they won't. I mean, we all just assume the worst thing is going to happen, or at least I do, but I think it's possible that courts will actually say, you can't do this. So for a variety of reasons, from its marginal utility to its propensity for spitting out bullshit, to the cost of running it, to the environmental issues, to legitimate concerns that the whole business model is one giant copyright violation, the future of generative AI is much hazier than its financial backers and hype hucksters would have us believe. So you might wonder how it's possible that these basic facts about generative AI could coexist with claims that it will fundamentally reshape every industry on the planet, blah, blah, blah. But this kind of hyperbole and resistance to reality is extremely common in the tech industry. Do you remember the cryptocurrency thing a couple years ago? You guys still got money, right? Remember when Facebook changed its name to Meta? Because the metaverse was going to change the world? Remember when Apple put out a computer that you wear on your face and we were told that was the future of computing? Well, I hope you remember because it was just 2 months ago and no one's talking about it. It's very common. So like with these other tech industry fads, there's a huge amount of distance between hype and reality with generative AI. It's not necessarily the case with other types of AI, though, that can really be quite powerful, if very ethically problematic. There's lots of other machine learning technology like facial recognition that is currently impacting people all over the world, compromising not only our liberty, but sometimes also people's lives. So face surveillance technology is one clear example of this. As it was mentioned before, we've been at the ACLU of Massachusetts working on a campaign to rein in government use of facial recognition, and we've been quite successful here in Massachusetts and in other parts of the country, banning the technologies used by government entirely in 8 cities in Massachusetts, including right here in Boston, Cambridge, Worcester, Springfield, passing a state law regulating police use of the technology. But that state law needs an overhaul. We're currently trying to get the state legislature to do that. The threat of corporate face tracking remains here in Massachusetts and in most parts of the country, and Massachusetts is an outlier. Most states don't have the rules at all. Artificial intelligence is also being used to sort resumes and even in the interview process, ensuring that historical discrimination and bias will be replicated via supposedly neutral technology. An infamous example of this problem unfolded at Amazon, which stopped using a resume sorting algorithm after it discovered that the system was chucking women's resumes in the trash. Why was this happening? Amazon trained its algorithm using the resumes of their most successful programmers. Guess who those were? Just one guess. As a result, the AI learned that men are the best programmers and directed any resume containing the word women or woman into the garbage. So, for example, if you had, women's rowing team, Brown University, on your resume, right in the trash. This story made national headlines, and it was kind of a scandal, at least in my world. But despite that, most Fortune 500 companies, 99% today, use similar technology in the hiring process. It can be much worse. Machine learning technology is also being used to disastrous effect by militaries. According to Israeli investigative journalists at this very good outlet, 972 magazine, part of the reason that the IDF's most recent assault on Gaza has been so destructive to human life and infrastructure is the military's use of machine learning technology to select targets for bombings. This has led observers to describe what's currently unfolding there as the world's first AI-backed genocide. So machine learning technology can be very powerful, but the power, as you've seen, generally accrues to those who already have it, entrenching existing power dynamics. And there are a lot of other problems as well. For one, and I hope if you remember one thing that I told you today about the problems, it's this. Powerful people and institutions too often reflexively look to adopt machine learning technology to provide relatively cheap, easy, quick fixes to what are, in fact, large, systemic, sometimes centuries or decades old problems. And this is something that I call techno-solutionism. In this kind of, basically, they can say, at least we're doing something, right? This is a scourge, in my opinion, at every level of our government. Doctors are overworked and stressed out, and they often do not have time to carefully document their interactions with patients after they've met with you. So a slew of AI companies has entered the fold, hoping to capitalize on one of the consequences of our healthcare system's profit-driven ethos, the failure to provide doctors with the time they need to deal with each patient in their care. And this is a classic example of techno-solutionism. And it's a classic example of one of the problems with AI today. Instead of taking a step back and asking why doctors are so stressed, why they don't have time to care for their patients, and then addressing the systemic issues with our healthcare system that are leading to these problems, because that's obviously hard and it takes enormous amount of time and resources and political capital, hospitals will just slap an AI on it and call it a day. And what's particularly dangerous about this is not just that it eludes dealing with the actual systemic problem, it can actually cause more problems than it solves. At least they can say they've done something, and crucially, at least someone is making money off of this, right? We see the same thing unfolding in the public sector as well, unfortunately. In my work, I run into it all the time. As cities rush to adopt so-called smart policing technologies like predictive policing, gunshot detection, and social media surveillance as means of addressing structural economic and social problems dating back generations: poverty, intergenerational trauma, lack of resources, poor education, poor healthcare. Many of these technologies will exacerbate racist policing practices and not do anything to make communities safer. But again, when politicians and police chiefs deploy them, they can say they're doing something to address actual problems like gun violence, which are very difficult to solve by addressing root causes. And the makers of these technologies, making matters even worse, are getting rich, creating a cottage industry that has a very strong financial interest in pushing back against activists like me, who are calling on our governments to drop the use of these tools and to address root causes. I'll say, though, that probably the most on-the-nose example of tech solutionism I've come across is this. Like, what? Okay, so this California city is training AI to locate homeless encampments? Bro, what are you doing? Like, oh my God. So anyway, once techno-solutionism, it's a huge problem with AI today, and once you've seen it, you really can't unsee it. It's almost everywhere. There are lots of other problems. Another fundamental problem with AI, as we all know, is that it requires data, big data, and that means surveillance. This creates huge incentives for more surveillance and creates massive privacy harms for all of us. So for an insurance company to use an AI to determine how much to charge you for life insurance, for example, it's got to get a lot of information about you. It's going to buy data from corporate data brokers. It's going to hoover up as much information as humanly possible, some of which might be totally inaccurate, because data brokers are not regulated in our society. Or say the government wants to use an AI to develop risk scores for visa applicants. It's also something that's happening. The AI is, of course, very data hungry and has to be fed all the information the government can scrape about people from, commercial and government databases, from the internet. Someone could be denied a visa to work or visit the United States, work in or visit the US, because the AI determined based on a secret data set fed into a secret algorithm that the person posed a threat to US security. It could be that the reason the algorithm said that is because in 2016, the person from Cameroon or whatever posted, hey, Donald Trump seems like a real racist. But the US visa official who's reviewing the application and sees this person poses a high risk may have no idea that that's why. Application denied. Meanwhile, again, in order to train these AI systems, the insurance company and the government have collected huge quantities of information about every living person and can use these data for innumerable other purposes. So another problem is that there's a cliche in machine learning that it is a great tool if you want to make the future look like the past because it's trained on historical data. Obviously, given US history, unless you want to live in an apartheid society where women and people of color have no rights nor economic power, that's a bad idea. To be clear, sometimes it's fine actually to use historical data to train machine learning systems. So like, if the city of Boston wants to use historical traffic pattern data to try to find a more efficient way for the compost trucks to get through the streets, like great, knock your socks off. But this technology poses very, very serious threats when it is used in situations that perpetuate historical injustice under the cover of technological sophistication and neutrality, which is very important. Not only is this data being fed into historical data that reflects, disparities and injustice in our system being fed into these systems, the output is then called neutral because it came out of some computer. Very dangerous. So for example, studies show that police have long disproportionately targeted Black and brown communities for drug arrests. Despite this problem, police have been feeding these biased historical data about drug arrests into so-called predictive policing technologies, which direct police to patrol specific neighborhoods looking for crime. So a Black person may be minding their business, driving to work, but the AI is telling the police that they're in a high drug trafficking area, and they look suspicious to the officer, so they pull them over. This kind of thing is happening right now, today, in the United States. But in a few years, the problem could be substantially worse. A police officer, imagine, with AI-enabled glasses, could see not a human being walking past him, but rather a facial recognition-triggered risk score, shading the person red, yellow, or green according to their level of risk. This is calculated, of course, by a proprietary algorithm fed on things like credit scores, employment histories, housing stability, social media posts, criminal records, and on and on. I can imagine, for example, an officer who has shot someone testifying in court and saying, Your Honor, the AI indicated the suspect was a high risk to public safety, and as he reached for his pocket, I feared for my life. So with these examples, we can see how AI can make life more difficult and dangerous, and is making life more difficult and dangerous, particularly for historically oppressed groups of people. As the problem of facial surveillance demonstrates, another central concern raised by machine learning technology is that efficiency and optimization can actually be very bad, depending on the context. Scholars Woody Hartzog and Evan Zelinger have called face surveillance the perfect tool of oppression because of how it enables governments to track everyone all the time in the present and the past with the click of a button. This kind of totalizing surveillance enables perfect enforcement or near perfect enforcement of the law. And that's what we're seeing in places like China, where the government is using facial surveillance technology to automatically send people arrest notifications for jaywalking. The government is also much more dangerously using facial surveillance to automate the systematic repression of the Uyghurs, the Muslim minority population in Xinjiang province. So sometimes efficiency is actually very good. I like efficiency in a lot of systems. We don't want police to enforce every violation of the law. If we did that, we would live in a police state. Limited police budgets and resources force police to focus on the most serious crimes, at least in theory. And that's a good thing. Technology like face surveillance upsets that balance, opening new avenues for the mass policing of petty offenses like trespass and loitering. We all know who's going to be charged with that. and enabling police to simply click a button to download a list of every person who attended a protest or a workers' rights picket line, even if they're watching that video from thousands of miles away. So efficiency is not always good. It can be extremely harmful. We can also see the downside. For those of you who are getting sleepy, I'm almost done. Don't despair. Okay, and we're getting to the exciting part. Okay. We can also see the downside of optimization in Amazon's workforce surveillance programs, as I mentioned before. Nothing in the law today prevents companies like Amazon from conducting invasive surveillance of workers and then using that information to punish them for the slightest deviation from unrealistic productivity. Punch back at companies like Amazon and force them to cut this out. They're going to keep doing this to the detriment of the well-being of their workers, to the detriment of the planet, but the workers are the ones who produce the value for their CEOs and stockholders, of course. And they're really getting the shit end of the stick here with this optimization scheme that is fulfilling Charles Babbage's dreams to an extent that he probably never could have predicted. Another fundamental problem with AI is neatly summed up by this slide from an IBM presentation from the 1970s. The 1970s, hey! So here's what it said. A computer can never be held accountable. Therefore, a computer must never make a management decision. Now, the younger people in the room might like this one. That's the updated version of the phrase. In response to this observation, this is obviously true, AI boosters will say that we don't have to worry because there's always going to be a human in the loop. Have you heard that? A human in the loop.
Yeah.
And this human will be responsible for making any final decision, so don't worry your pretty little heads about the AI. But this woefully fails to address the real issues with AI and does not meet the challenge of protecting our basic rights or the public interest from this technology for a few reasons. Number one, studies show, this is very interesting, studies show that people are likely to believe what a computer tells them, even if their own eyes tell them it's not true. We are, one of the things that's amazing about technology, I think one of the reasons why I'm deviating from the script, people are kind of willing to believe the AI hype is that this shit is amazing, right? Smartphones are amazing. For a decade or something, we were able to just reach into our pocket and find any information that's available ever in human history. That is truly incredible. And so I think because of that, we have sort of learned the wrong lesson from technology, that it can never make mistakes, right? And this study shows clearly that people do believe what technology tells them, even when their own intuition is telling them that it's wrong. It's very important to understand that. Second, another reason why human in the loop fails to address the problems is that humans understand incentives within organizations, right? We all do. We all have bosses, unless you're the boss. Congrats. But then the board's your boss, I guess, right? We understand incentives within organizations. We're not likely to reject an AI's recommendations if the boss has told us that the AI is an important part of the workflow, or if the company has spent tens, hundreds, or even millions of dollars, or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars on the technology. The expectation is going to be to listen to the machine, and workers are going to comply, particularly when, like in the warfare context, where the IDF is using the technology to pick targets for bombings, the algorithm takes some of the emotional burden out of the job. And these are just some of the problems with AI systems. There are many others, including a lack of transparency about the data and training methods, unclear or non-existent due process protections, outright racial and gender bias, an inability to opt out of AI systems impacting our lives, and the so-called explainability crisis with deep learning, which is something that we haven't even talked about, which even the makers of those technologies do not and cannot understand. So all of this is very troubling, obviously, but particularly in light of the fact that our country has no modern privacy or digital rights law to protect ordinary people like us from the harms deriving from mass surveillance or algorithmic decision-making. And it's even more troubling, given that billions of dollars of tech industry profits rest on the kind of on the status quo remaining unchanged. But despite all of that, there is cause for optimism, and not the Mark Andreessen kind. One thing, probably the biggest thing that gives me hope, is unions. Unions are growing again, and they are pushing back hard against both the billionaire class and the Silicon Valley insistence that they, and only they, will determine the future and our relationship to technology in it. We recently saw some very hopeful action in Hollywood. This was a solidarity action here in Massachusetts, confronted with the specter of chatbots and generative AI actors replacing them in script rooms and on sets. Writers and actors in Hollywood said, hell no, we have power in this situation, and we're going to use it to get what we want. And they did that using a very old technology, solidarity. They refused to work until the studios agreed that they would not use AI to replace actors or writers, so victory secured, not just for those workers, but frankly for all of us who care about art and would like to watch movies and television shows that aren't AI-generated slop for the next 50 years. But other unions are also sounding the alarm. Just this past week, a few days ago, the National Nurses United, the largest nurses union in the country, representing over 200,000 workers nationwide, released a statement on AI's impact on nursing and healthcare, pushing back against the notion that AI can or should replace human care providers. I'm going to read it to you, it's short. Quote, nurses know that AI technology and algorithms are owned by corporations that are driven by profit, not a desire to improve patient care conditions or advance the nursing profession, the statement says. It goes on. The hospital industry, in cooperation with Silicon Valley and Wall Street, will use AI to further its dangerous effort to displace RNs from the physical care of their patients, prioritizing low-cost or free labor over patient needs. So clearly these nurses are gearing up for a fight about AI, and thank God. As these organized workers recognize, each of us has a tremendous amount of power in our own spheres, particularly when we band together, at work, at school, in our communities, to shape our government, and even socially. These workers are inventing hope through their collective action, and hope, like fear, is contagious. As the unions are demonstrating, we each retain more power than the Mark Andreessens of the world would have us believe. So I'm going to close by asking you to flex that power. Is someone in your office floating the idea of using AI in the hiring process? Push back. Show them the clear and documented evidence that workers can be harmed from these tools, particularly workers of color and women. Is your local school committee debating whether to allow students to use ChatGPT in the classroom? Get involved and voice your opinion that allowing students to use tools that provide them with misinformation, all right, this is my opinion, but it could be yours, that allowing students to use tools that provide them with misinformation and cheat them out of an opportunity to learn how to conduct research and to write is not good for their education. Advocate instead that they teach students about how large language models work, so they understand the technology is not magic, but is in fact flawed and prone to misinformation and bias. Are your friends talking about how cool generative AI is at a social gathering? Ask them what they think about AI telling people it's safe to eat mushrooms that will turn your liver into liquid, or search engines falling apart because of the glut of AI trash taking over the internet. Is your police department planning to adopt predictive policing software or facial recognition software? Write to your city councilors, the mayor, the police chief, and tell them that they should never use technology that replicates historical racism or harbors racial or gender bias. Are you in a decision-making role at your company or institution? Exercise real leadership by refusing to hop on the hype bandwagon of AI and instead listen to experts who don't stand to profit from the technology. All of us can choose not to do business with companies that violate workers' rights and fight unionization efforts. We can talk to our children about how Gen AI actually works and remind them that Alexa does not know anything because Alexa is a machine and machines are not capable of knowing. We can teach them these technologies rely on mass surveillance and rampant privacy invasions and the invisible labor of thousands of low-paid workers in far-flung corners of the globe. We can warn them that far too many systems that are sold as smart, televisions, toasters that have Wi-Fi in them, are worse versions of products we have been contentedly using for generations. We can join and financially support organizations like the ACLU that are fighting for government rules and regulations to prohibit the use of artificial intelligence in areas related to employment, benefits provision, criminal legal enforcement, housing, and child protection, among other red line areas where the use of the technology poses an unacceptable risk to basic rights. And every time we hear a government official tell us that they intend to adopt AI as a means of addressing some systemic injustice or a crisis long in the making, we can reject the premise and demand solutions that address root causes instead of the application of a technological band-aid that is likely to actually make things worse. Ultimately, we can and must demand that our elected officials put the interests of ordinary people and the climate over the profit interests of the richest people on earth. We can demand of our government at every level that they refuse to join the cult of Silicon Valley in shredding our privacy and offering up our humanity at the altar of big tech's profits. We can demand they wage antitrust campaigns to bring these companies down to earth. We can insist they pass strong privacy laws without giving in to industry propaganda about so-called harming innovation. We can tell them we want robust worker protections for the 21st century that rein in harmful surveillance and unsafe productivity expectations, and if they refuse, we can find other people to run for office who will act in accordance with the public interest. For the big tech billionaires, the future is predetermined. They've already decided. They're its boy kings. But in the real world, numerous levers and areas of contestation remain, where ordinary people, the people in this room, organized people, have the power to push back and throw our own weight around in the battle for the future. Of course, reorienting our technology in service of the common good is not going to be easy, and just as AI is political technology, attaining democratic control of the technology is going to require deep engagement with politics and a transformation of the political status quo. Whether for good or ill, the problems we face with our technology today are not distinct from the problems we face with our democracy. There is a reason billionaires and wealthy tech companies have outsized influence on our politics, and until we counter that power with organized people power, we will continue to face the same problems with both our technology and our democracy. To ensure technology benefits all of us in future generations, instead of accelerating authoritarianism and climate collapse and exacerbating wealth and power inequality, we must fix our democracy. So that obviously begins with participation, but it also requires something much more fundamental. And this is a religious institution, so I'm going to ask you to have faith with me. It requires that you believe that a different world is in fact possible. Big tech wants us all to think that the only plausible business model for modern technology is theirs, surveillance capitalism. But nonprofits like the Signal Foundation, the maker of one of the world's most important privacy-preserving technologies, which is used by tens of millions of people around the world, show that that's not true. There are powerful interests that want to curtail not just our rights, but our imaginations, to prevent us from building a world organized by technology and politics that center human creativity, justice, and freedom. But as Dorothy Day did during her lifetime, we can and must choose to believe in something better than the dystopian, self-interested vision offered by today's robber barons of industry. And we can act on those beliefs in every area of our public and private lives. Undoubtedly, the world faces genuine perils in climate collapse and in rising authoritarianism across the globe. But that is precisely why we do not have the luxuries to spare. So while big tech insists that most of what human beings are good at can be done better by a machine, I'm going to leave you with this. Prove them wrong by envisioning something different and then organizing with other people and engaging at every level of our society to create a future in which our democracy and our technology benefit all of us, not merely the lucky few. The creation of this freer future is not only possible, but it's necessary, and it starts with you. Thank you very much.